Hello, and welcome to Bracewell's Data Center Counsel podcast. From energy and utilities to siting and financing, our attorneys cover the opportunities and issues with data center development.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Bracewell Data Center Counsel podcast. This is Scott Segal, and I'm the head of our policy section in Washington, D.C., and it's my pleasure today to be joined by Tamara McKinzie, who represents commercial clients in the energy sector and has served as real estate counsel for a bunch of negotiations, acquisitions, and development in multi-generation data center developments. And that's perfect background for the item that we're going to discuss today, which is emerging markets for data centers. And there was a time, Tamara, when if you talked about data centers, you were talking very specifically about just a few miles from where I'm sitting in Northern Virginia. And there was a corridor there. And little did we know that we were going to have all these sort of gating concerns about energy availability, water supply, all these different things. And because we have had that, and because of the somewhat funky governance of the power sector that includes Northern Virginia through its PJM. In fact, as we sit here today, all the PJM states, their governors, were over at the White House talking about what they were going to do to try and fix the queuing problem for electricity there. So we had all these gating problems. And you've had a front row seat for it. So let me begin by asking you, talk to me a little bit about those historical locations where data center development had been focused, kind of like the tech corridor in Northern Virginia, and then bring us through some of the other historical locations that emerged thereafter, like Texas and Oklahoma, largely some rural areas, and tell us about some of the limitations that obtain in those areas and determine what will be emerging markets and what won't be. So what do you think?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. You're absolutely right that Virginia was for some time, really just a hotspot for data center development, and certainly, other kind of historical tech hubs. We've seen some interest in places like Chicago, Dallas. I've seen a little bit of interest in Houston, for example. But my practice, the last couple of years, I've seen quietly data center developers are definitely focused on more rural areas. Primarily, we've been working in Texas, kind of West Texas and the Panhandle, a little bit into the Central Texas area, where I'm seeing a number of my clients just have a lot of interest in agricultural properties. I can voice my suspicions as to why that is. I think large tracts of land are available and affordable in those areas, and that's really been a focus for a number of developers. We're also seeing a lot of movement into Oklahoma, largely for the same reasons, I suspect. And recently, I've started to see some interest in Kentucky, the Dakotas, for example, some South Carolina movement. So we're really seeing it across the board, really, in just about every state that we've practiced in. But I think that we're definitely seeing a shift of those developers away from kind of the hubs and into these sort of sparsely populated areas where, perhaps land use restrictions are, somewhat more limited, and the property is just available and affordable.
Let me tease out that issue of building in rural areas or on rural land. I noticed the other day that the voluble and effervescent Texas Agricultural Commissioner, Sid Miller, had a proposal to set up these sort of data-free zones in agricultural areas. I think he called them, I can't remember, agricultural free zones, I think it is, or something along those lines. And the notion being that once you develop agricultural lands, and of course not all rural land is agricultural land, but once you develop agricultural lands into a data center or any other industrial use for that matter, that you can't bring it back. This is the theory, at least, behind this. And so since it's important to husband our resources for agricultural production, do you see pushback occurring in rural areas where once, as you put it, and I know of at least one movie that uses this as a quote, the huge tracts of land that obtain in rural areas. Are you noticing that maybe there's some pushback on that because of a concern over conservation of agricultural land? Could be from farmers, from the agricultural industry, could be from politicians in agricultural areas, or it could be from next door neighbors or whatnot. who are concerned about irrigation and things like that.
Sure. I do think we're starting to see some pushback. And it's hard to say exactly who the pushback is from. I'm largely hearing this anecdotally, maybe from some of my clients. But, the data center developments have become far more publicized than they were. And I think people are starting to get more concerned. And so residents are concerned about electricity prices. They're concerned about water prices. They're concerned about noise. They're concerned about a lot of the things that are going on around here. And so when you talk about agricultural areas in particular, I think there's some concern that, if a data center developer comes in and buys up all of this acreage in the middle of an historically agricultural area, even the surrounding areas that aren't being developed or aren't subject to that development may be affected. And I think that we're seeing a lot of pushback and concern largely for those reasons. And that may be what's driving the recent push to restrict development in agricultural zones.
Now, moving beyond rural siting and things like that, pick up your magic 8-ball and ask it what you're seeing on down the line in terms of trends. Are there any new regions that have started to be attractive to developers? What are you seeing?
Yeah, I like I said before, I think we're just now starting to see some interest in, the Dakotas. Kentucky is one we've got a brand new deal that's new. I think still focused on kind of rural and agricultural areas, but definitely in other states outside of kind of the typical. I was actually going to ask you what you see as the likely next series of trends based on what you're seeing in the regulatory and government fields.
Sure. And I'm happy to give my 2 cents on it. I mean, when I ask myself what makes any one particular state attractive for power sector, for data center development, that is in part a political question because we have all these things we've got to deal with. And some of those obstacles to development can only be dealt with on a political level. So, first and foremost, there are whatever packages of incentives or tax abatements that might be made available. I think there's an expectation on the part of developers, or at least there was an expectation on the part of power sector developers that a certain amount of favorable tax treatment would be available. In the state of Texas, for example, as you know, we're an ad valorem taxing jurisdiction. We don't have income taxes. And so the question was on a county by county basis, what kind of abatements in tax collection might there be available? Now, I did notice the other day, and I'm sure you took interest in it too, that Microsoft announced its new initiative. And the president, of course, chimed in with a Truth Social posting that at about the same time Microsoft was making their announcement, which was to say that they were not going to be so heavily reliant on tax abatements, and they were going to not burden shift essentially to utility ratepayers, which I think was probably, good news for some. We'll have to see how that actually turns out in practice, or if it's even possible, depending on what kind of infrastructure is needed. But it does bring me to a question generally for states and what makes them attractive, that, this sort of speed to power question, what kind of credible interconnection path is there for bringing energy to bear for new data centers? What is the utility posture, the regulatory structure for utilities in that area? What is the build time for substations and transmission lines in the area? All these affect, I think, the energy portfolio side of the attractiveness of new states. And what is needed? Well, regulatory clarity is needed. And this is what the states are being told. That includes everything from, zoning that allows data centers by right in targeted industrial areas, predictable permitting. Both in Washington and in each of our state capitals, permitting reform is a big issue, and trying to make sure that we can accelerate and streamline our permitting. The ability to phase in campuses is important also as part of that regulatory clarity. At the top of the key, I talked about the sort of power market structure, whether or not you have a regional transmission organization like the poor benighted PJM, which serves states in my neck of the woods up here. And PJM doesn't even have a CEO as we sit here today. Their CEO left office at the end of December, and he left an organization that was having a great deal of difficulty with its so-called queuing for new demand and for new generation to be brought on and connected to the grid. So that was problematic. I think there's also a problem at a political level with if you want to build, we used to call it behind the fence line, but if you want to build co-located power, there are obstacles that present in our federal law under the Federal Power Act and its regulations. And I noticed the other day, not that I think any legislation I refer to at the federal level is necessarily going to pass anytime soon. I noticed the other day that that Tom Cotton from Arkansas introduced a bill that said for large loads, if those large loads had their own power sources, then the legislation would allow for the waiving of Federal Power Act and, say, DOE regulatory constraints, which is interesting because that is an obstacle that needs to be overcome. We talk about it a lot. Candidly, I'm not sure that it takes legislation to do that, but directionally, I understand what he was talking about. And of course, it's not open field running on legislation like that either, because anything that totally establishes a direction for co-located power or power that is independent of the grid, or is, in the words of his legislation, sort of wholly isolated from the grid, is not something that's going to make the local investor-owned utility or even some of the independent power providers who are counting on, power purchase agreements. It's not going to make them necessarily happy to see that be a policy change that obtains. So they've got to kind of take a look at that. We've got a lot of political issues that deal with, where we're going to develop. And I'm excited about some of it, which is, well, let me just say that anecdotally, I would add to your list, and I'd be interested to hear your reaction to any of these folks I'm about to add to the list. You said Kentucky and the Dakotas. I would also add the metropolitan Atlanta area. I went to school in Atlanta, so I always kind of watched there. I like to think that I was the data center in Atlanta, but now they're thinking of building data centers there. And how are they attracting data centers? Now remember, Georgia is a heavily regulated market, right? It has a strong Public Utilities Commission, and it's a heavily regulated market. Well, part of it is discipline in the queue there. So Georgia Power in that region has stricter rules, end user commitments, zoning confirmations, and they can assist the construction of the data center with those and other industrial energy users with overcoming that. They've also talked about a much more transparent and aggressive pipeline of additional generation. Georgia Power has about something north of about 8 gigs of new generation that's slated to start after 2030. Of course, this is 2026, so that's not immediately. But if you're trying to plan for a future for construction, that's I think good news. And Georgia was the site of the very first new construction of utility scale nuclear energy in many decades. So I think that's good too. Have you been hearing anything about Georgia or maybe the Carolinas or what else?
I've definitely been hearing a little bit about South Carolina.
Yes.
I can't think of any deals that I've been involved in with North Carolina, but that's definitely an area that we've seen some movement. Anecdotally, I would agree. I have heard about some development in Georgia and Atlanta specifically. I haven't been involved in any of those deals. And that's really interesting what you say about the infrastructure and the organizational infrastructure, maybe as much as the power infrastructure there, because I do think that that's going to largely guide where these areas become attractive or less attractive. You mentioned PJM. I'd love to hear your thoughts about ERCOT's recent activity and whether we think that that's going to have a negative impact on the future development in Texas.
Well, Texas is one of many states, and ERCOT is one of many regulators that is casting a side glance at data center development to make sure that it doesn't interfere with power needs writ large in the state. And Texas has had its challenges. I mean, I think many of the people listening to this podcast, some of them are resident in Texas and will obviously understand what I'm talking about, but has had their issues with electric reliability and the like. Now, there's been a bit of a difference between North Texas and South Texas, frankly, as far as reliability is concerned. And I noted the other day that Vistra, the major power provider in North Texas, has announced a major power purchase agreement for data center development with the nuclear capacity out of Comanche Peak. And I think that's important because it illustrates an important point. In fact, I know I have been involved in another one of these podcasts where we talked about the kind of unique attributes of nuclear energy for a data center, because it is 24/7. It's obviously base load, but it it also has a high degree of reliability. Once a utility scale nuclear plant is up and running, it is easy to generate more electricity off of the same nameplate, boilerplate, and it's easy to assure reliability. So those are things that even ERCOT can't screw up. So Texas does have some generally favorable attributes. We've got good, generally speaking, we've got good power companies who understand their markets and have lived in a world that is, I won't say it's 100% deregulated. I'll say it's quasi-deregulated. And they've been able to ride to the sound of the guns as far as answering power demand is concerned. And since Texas has gone through very high-profile power issues with respect to its retail market, they are careful. And so I like Texas. I don't understand completely this business about trying to preserve farmland, but the rest of it I think I understand pretty well, and I think Texas is doing a nice job. It does bring me to a question, whether you're talking about ERCOT or the state of Texas. What is it that or what policies, I suppose, could a state adopt that will allow it to win more data center attention if it seeks it? And now, not all states are seeking more data center attention, but as I began to think about it, I think that in order to be truly hospitable for data centers, a state has to create what I would call kind of a power-ready industrial playbook. They need to have things like pre-zoned districts. They need to be willing to fast-track permitting. They need to be willing to allow for pre-built transmission and substation plans, which frankly are just part of the normal hygiene you would have in a functional grid. They need to make it feasible, in other words, and create a pocket of certainty around development in a particular state. They've got to require credible load evidence. I mean, what we're hearing is, and I bet you're hearing this too, is that sometimes there will be 4 proposals for every one proposal that's actually going to be built. And we have to deter, to the extent possible, we need to deter that speculation in favor of more transparency, which requires some credible evidence that load will actually be required, or we're not going to build out sufficient load for these data centers. And, they have to align such incentives as they're offering with actually putting gravy on the plate. They've got to tie tax breaks to delivered capacity, to making whole the local tax base, making sure that there aren't a fall off in programs, maybe adopt particular standards regarding water use, energy efficiency, cooling demand, cooling standards, things like that that are achievable regulatory objectives, but that are also necessary in order to have a certain density in power centers or in data centers in a particular state. So they got a plan. They got a plan for load growth. They've got a plan for water usage. They've got a plan for handling the other obstacles that you talked about, which are things like, noise. I mean, I was once told by somebody, and I don't know that this is true, that depending on the equipment that's installed at a data center, they can be quite noisy. They can sound a little bit like a airplane. And since they famously run 24/7, as we know, intermittency is not the friend of data centers. Those can be challenging from an emerging markets perspective. People have to understand it. I think states that have lived with either industrialization, extractive industries, probably are better suited from a community relations perspective to welcome data centers. Because even though data centers have water use issues and are consumers of electricity, they are not stovepipe industries. They don't have, for example, visible air pollution. Some friends of mine in the environmental community have told me before that they like to call it digital pollution that they have, because on either upstream or downstream, they are stimulating either power generation or further industrial development, which does have legitimate air pollution concerns. But I don't think people, when they look at the data center, reach that conclusion. So I don't believe that's really an obstacle. So, but I do think that states that are used to extractive industries and industrialization are far more likely to be welcoming to a data center, because
I agree.
In some respects, no pun intended, it's a breath of fresh air compared to what they're used to.
I agree with that. And something that you said a few minutes ago about, what can states do to be more attractive to this sort of industry? You use the word certainty. And I think from a real estate perspective, what I'll say is that a lot of our clients are really challenged to enter into agreements with landowners that give them enough time to do the diligence, to do the work, to make sure that infrastructure will be available, to make sure that they're going to be able to get some permitting while making an attractive deal with landowners. Because if you've got 3 years, 4 years, 5 years to take all of this into account, landowners don't really want that sort of uncertainty. So talking about speed to power or just efficiency in being able to get through that process and have some certainty that development is imminent, I think that's going to be a really valuable component as developers continue to kind of weigh their options across the states, because that really is so challenging when they're trying to negotiate with landowners and get a piece of land under contract to take title to a piece of land until they know that they can actually develop.
We talk about this in terms of what the government, the regulator can do, the local utility or power provider can do to create this hospitable and more certain environment. But, a lot of these aspects, you can make almost any jurisdiction into a hospitable emerging market, I believe, with the right kind of playbook on the part of the developer too. And so, let me put it this way. No state in the union, no matter how red or how blue, likes to have a lack of transparency on the part of the developer. They don't like it. They don't want it. Even if for good, solid, confidential business reasons, 100% transparency is not available. They do not like the idea that the default assumption is a lack of transparency, particularly when you're dealing with grid impact and reliability, with emissions and air permitting, with water and cooling, with land use and community relations questions, with guardrails put on to ensure that there's sufficient economic value associated with the data center, and with timelines, predictable timelines. The developer should have a playbook that takes all that into account too. Now, a lot of that's beyond their ability to do it, but I wanted to get your reaction to something, because I sit on the board of an organization called Conserve America. One of the things we've been talking about as a not-for-profit organization that deals with natural resource conservation issues is basing on the premise that data centers are essential, but there's a right way and a wrong way to do data centers, to create a template of some of those issues and to evaluate plans for data centers and then offer what I can only call a good housekeeping seal of approval on whether someone meets an appropriate approach to data center build out. Now, this is not dissimilar to what was done in the oil and gas industry when we started to have hydraulic fracturing occurring in areas that hadn't had oil and gas development in decades, right? Because they were very confused. Those citizens in those areas were quite confused. And so that same idea of third-party evaluation of plans became kind of a best practice that helped developers in that industry meet with some common ground with the state regulators in particular. And it also helped them, I think, candidly, on strategic communications and community relations and the like. I wonder what you think about that. If there's if a plan can be evaluated in a way where assurances obtain with respect to water, power use, planning, timing, things like that, whether you think that might improve the chances of a successful outcome in an emerging market.
I certainly think it might. It's an interesting point. One of the things that I think is really challenging, though, to that sort of development in the industry is how very private our data center development clients are. They view this as very, very competitive. They're very, very, for lack of a better word, they're secretive about their development plans, about how they approach. Among the clients that I do work with, I can't say that I necessarily see a lot of consistency in how they approach their evaluation of properties and how they approach their development plans. And so I think that's something that may be helpful in, certainly working with the public and the governmental entities that need to be involved here. Because if they start to see some consistency and, like you said, a template, that could be to everybody's benefit. But we may be a little ways away from the developers being interested in doing that simply because they're trying so hard to protect what they view as a proprietary business model. And that may be something that's driven by, for example, you mentioned Microsoft's recent announcement earlier. That's going to put pressure, I think, on some of these smaller developers or more quiet developers to follow suit in some cases. And that may be the driving force that starts to move them toward a template, as you described.
Right. In Washington, of course, we measure things in terms of distance to the next election. And of course, we're within a year of the midterm congressional elections. And whether you're talking about what comes directly from President Trump, as he reemphasized in his Detroit Economic Club speech the other day, or whether we're talking about just members of congressional delegations, it is clear to me that affordability is going to be one of the most important issues in the upcoming election. Now, affordability really has sort of four component parts: housing, healthcare, food prices, and then power prices, utility prices, because utility prices have gone up faster than the inflation rate. There is a question about how to handle affordability when we deal with this, when we deal with data center build-outs. And I think it's going to advantage some states and disadvantage other states as far as it goes. Chris Wright, the Secretary of Energy, makes an interesting point, though, that states that are welcoming to data center development are going to end up finding ways to more than cost share the build out of infrastructure, particularly grid or transmission infrastructure, candidly on the back of some of these projects. And of course, the Microsoft announcement is similar to that, and the president's statement is similar to that too, that there ought to be more cost sharing of that sort. I wonder what you think of that. Are you hearing when you, no matter what state you're in, when you are seeking to build something out, are you hearing this affordability mantra, this pushback on affordability with respect to power bills? And what about that notion, though, that the job you are doing is part of building out infrastructure, which can encourage more and better transmission, which actually alleviates power costs? Is that dynamic apparent to you when you're engaging in development?
I think that dynamic is apparent to me. I think that our clients could really use our advice and assistance in how they communicate these things, because we're not necessarily seeing the understanding of how that operates when you're talking about some of the smaller governments that are reviewing and approving plans, for example, the communities that are, engaging in pushback and having conversations with developers about their concerns as to affordability and energy prices. So I think we could do a better job, and our clients can do a better job, and developers can do a better job in really communicating the big picture the way you described it. Communities don't understand it, and they need to.
I'm so glad you said that, because it really is interesting to me. Our firm is obviously very deeply involved in power industry issues. We're also deeply involved in data center development, and even further upstream, we're involved in bringing more energy to market. So all of these issues we're involved in quite closely. But you and I have very different practices, because you actually get in there and negotiate deals for development from a strong real estate background, whereas I am a public policy attorney that deals with some of these same issues, but in a completely different way. I don't think there are many firms that are active in the data center development space that are really where the rubber hits the road on the actual build out of data centers, that also provide the deep structure analysis on public policy and do strategic communications, community relations, branding exercises, all the rest of it under one roof. I deal with firms, and I'm sure people who are listening to the podcast deal with firms all the time that don't do all of those things under one roof. And what ends up happening is there's a weak link. When you don't do it all together, someone, to put it in a lawyer's parlance, someone's losing privilege, and someone's doing something that isn't appropriately supervised. And I think Bracewell's in a pretty, not to make this too much advertisement, but I think Bracewell's in a good position to hit on all of those pistons. And I think what the power industry knows, because they're largely a public-facing industry, and what the data center developers and the technology companies are increasingly learning is that you have to have each of those clubs in your bag. You can't play the course with just jobs, for example, or economic growth. It's got to be more than that. You got to be able to address all these things. And that takes an approach to comms, politics, real estate, regulation, and finance. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's funny that you say that, because I've said something recently that's very similar. I think there's a lot of firms that are developing a data center practice. I think what's unique about Bracewell is that we really already had one. We just needed to have the communication among the various practice groups that are relevant. And we really have all of the pieces to kind of hit the ground running and to advise our clients on these kinds of issues.
I have enjoyed this very much, and I think we're about to wrap it up. I'll end on one little point, and let's see what you think of this. So I'm going to give you the last word.
Okay.
So my one little point I wanted to end on from my perspective is we talked all day today about emerging markets defined as states or regions within the United States. From PJM, we talked about Georgia, we talked about the Carolinas, we talked about Kentucky, we talked about the Dakotas, we talked about Texas and Oklahoma. We really covered the ground. We didn't even talk about Arizona and New Mexico, even though with their with the amount of, particularly take the state of New Mexico, with the amount of federal land it has, and this administration's penchant for wanting to build on federal land in order to advance permitting, that we have to look at any state that has a lot of federal land. So all of those have in common that they're all states of the United States. In the future, I think we're seeing a pattern that's going to be very similar globally. Developers are chasing power, chasing minimization of cost, speed to market, and policy stability. I think the trick is policy stability is something that the United States, we have a very well-developed, obviously, judicial and regulatory system, so that's something we can assure. Other parts of the world may hit on all those other items better than we do. They may go faster. They may be willing to transfer power away from other sources and put it into data centers, all seeking that. But the political stability is something that I think they'll be missing. These international emerging markets are often where power is available sooner and where permitting is more predictable, if only political stability would hold up as well. I know it's maybe a little outside of your comfort zone, but what do you think? And Bracewell obviously negotiates certainly international power projects. I am certain international data projects as well, out of our offices in London and in Paris and in Dubai in particular. But what do you think about that? This trade-off between sort of political stability, which is absolutely necessary for certainty, and merely having the power and a quick permitting regime. You can talk about international if you want, but that's really the trade-off we're talking about.
Yeah, and you're right that it's a little bit outside of my comfort zone, but I do think that it's going to depend a little bit on the developer's specific long-term plans. Because if you're looking to get something up and running off the ground and efficiency is your number one priority, that political stability might take a back seat. But to some of our more sophisticated developers who truly do have a long-term business goal in mind, I agree with you that I think that's going to be a critical component of their decision-making and the markets that they move into.
All right. Well, that's great. Hey, Tamara, this has been great talking to you. It's always great to talk to a practitioner that has literally gotten her hands dirty on building out of a project. This is not a pun on you being a real estate lawyer. It grounds me for me to be able to talk to in a public policy context with somebody like you. And, let's go out there and build us some data centers. So
let's do it.
All right. Thanks very much, Tamara.
Thanks so much, Scott.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Bracewell's Data Center Counsel podcast. To contact any of today's guests, please reach out to datacentercounsel@bracewell.com.